Hi, my name's Anthony Castronovo, and I'm an artist and an educator here in Gainesville, Florida. I work mostly as a sculptor, and my work is mostly about ecology, looking at the relationship between humans and nature, and looking at art and the potential of art to connect people and as an activist tool. I teach classes at Santa Fe College and at the University of Florida, both in the sculpture area and in digital media. And last year I had the chance to teach a new course called Picturing Ecology, which was a course where we looked at artists that make work about the environment, and we developed a collaborative project as a group. And pretty immediately the Copper Superfund Site issue came up as something that we wanted to work on. And we developed an exhibition called Picturing Ecology, where all of the students made work about the Copper Superfund Site, and we had a public opening. And that exhibit was very successful. There was a really good turnout, and it created a lot of conversations that are continuing to this day. So that's where I got started with the Superfund project. Shortly thereafter, Kim Popejoy asked me if I would be interested in co-chairing, helping him form a committee that would be based on the idea of using art to explore the science and get the community involved in this Copper Superfund issue.
The Superfund site in Gainesville is the Coppers Cabot Superfund site, and the reason it's called the Cabot Coppers is there were two companies that had industrial processes on these properties, actually going back into, I think, 1916 or something. So there were these industrial activities going on for that long, and actually neither of the companies are still actively using the properties for any kind of manufacturing. They've closed down their operations, but the Superfund site is really the legacy left over from the way they managed or mismanaged their waste materials and their hazardous materials storage and things like that. So really, it's the legacy of almost 100 years of chemical handling and mishandling.
The Superfund Art Project wants to use the visual and the performing arts in order to deal with this issue in a positive way. When I was working with the city of Gainesville, one of the rewarding things that I found was how you could bring citizens and government together to solve problems. And as the gallery director for the Thomas Center, it was always a challenge because you have a wide variety of different constituencies, people with all sorts of different ideas about what art should be, how it should be displayed. And you also had the city government, and you had rules and regulations that had to be followed. So trying to work with all of these different factors was a challenge, but also a very rewarding experience. And it convinced me that citizens can work with the government, and they can work with governmental agencies such as the EPA, and they can work with corporate partners and even corporations that are not so positively disposed in order to combine forces and have a positive outcome. And that's the whole point behind the Superfund Art Project. We want to see a positive outcome. We want to take a liability and turn it into an asset.
One of the concerns is every time it rained when they were operating, some of the waste materials that were in some of these holding lagoons or in some of the chemical process areas, the rain would wash these chemicals into a drainage ditch, and that would make its way to Springstead Creek, and then Springstead Creek flows into Hogtown Creek. So there was probably over a long time of the operation of these chemical plants, there was, every time it rained, you probably had a pulse of chemicals that were really being flushed into the creeks.
What attracted me to the Superfund Art Project was simply the fact that I grew up on the creek below the Superfund site, and saw the creek go from beautiful, clean, pristine, swimmable water to covered with creosote after one dumping, and then that creosote destroyed everything in the creek and left a terrible smell, and we lived with that at our house all through my formative years. Until I was in my 20s, there was still visible banks of creosote. And so I grew up with the creek and the pollution from the copper site all my life. It was just a a major impact on my life.
But back at the time when these lagoons were breached by the developer, all of this material just seeped into the creek, and we had a big problem with just very nasty tarry-like material that had flowed into the creek, killed a lot of the fish and wildlife, and you know, you can go back and look at old Gainesville Sun articles from that time period, and even back then, people were coming to the Gainesville City Commission complaining about the nuisance, and there were articles in the Gainesville Sun way back into the 1960s complaining about what had happened.
I am a psychologist, and I spend most of my life working with trauma patients who have been in war zones. And living next to a Superfund site is a lot like that in many ways. You're dealing with people who are in a helpless, powerless position, have a level of stress that's ongoing, and they have to rely on authority figures to rescue them or not. And what is interesting about that to me, aside from the professional interest, is the experience of the neighbors, the survivors of this experience, versus the technicians and the politicians who are involved in the cleanup. And the very different worlds of the two of those groups, they speak a different language, and they express themselves very differently. So the piece that I've worked up kind of highlights that difference in experience and in speaking language, the nomenclature that each of these groups use.
First of all, a lot of this waste material they were putting in the ground, at the time they put it there, unfortunately it wasn't against the law, and part of that was probably just ignorance. We didn't have the pollution control laws and the environmental awareness that we have today, and so for years they had these soakage pits, and really the idea is that you'd pour these waste materials in these pits, and all they really knew is that some of the stuff disappeared. No one really thought about where did it go, but these soakage pits, or these percolation ponds, that was another thing they called them, they were really intended to get rid of this liquid chemical waste material, have it seep deep into the ground, and no one, it was sort of like out of sight, out of mind. No one really thought about it.
I got involved in the Superfund Art Project because of a friend of mine by the name of Margaret Talbert. And she is a local artist who has a keen interest in the springs of Florida. And the copper site has polluted the main stem of Hogtown Creek. And I used to hike up that thing with my kids looking for shark's teeth and stuff like that. And on a hot summer day, it'd be sure nice to, you know, find a little deep pool and take a swim. But we could never do that up on Hogtown Creek, mainly because of coppers. I realize coppers isn't the only problem that these creeks face. There are other pollution sources and just other problems that urban creeks in general face. And but coppers, of course, is a very significant one. The pollution with all those chemicals in the main stem of Hogtown Creek.
So I am an artist. I feel my emotions and I create my world with my art. One of the latest pieces I did was about a community lymphatic system. It's about how we as a community are intricately connected. Interestingly enough, a lot of the work turned into an aquifer. I feel like as a community we're flowing and affecting everything we do. And that's why this toxic site seeping into the aquifer struck me severely. Like, what are we doing? We're poisoning this beautiful system underneath that's connecting us to all of Florida, to the oceans. So I feel like as an artist, we have the power to educate, illuminate, but we can imagine brand new things that the EPA or the government or the big money makers, they're not even paying attention to. And artists in general use their emotions to change form into other forms, and that's what I'm talking about. We can transform with our imagination in ways that we can't even imagine yet, because we gotta just keep dreaming.
Region 4 is the southeastern United States, and that's the designation that the Environmental Protection Agency gives to this part of the country. And yet Region 4 sounds to me almost like something out of science fiction, like Area 9 or something, where it has a kind of impersonality, a kind of an alien quality to it. And so one of the things we really are trying to do with this exhibit is to personalize that. to make it not just something that's in Region 4, but a specific site. Because there are many of these sites scattered, 1,100 of them around the United States. Each one has a particular story. Each one has citizens that are impacted by it. And so this is our own Region 4 site. And the Cabot Copper site is something that's very personal to us.
When I got the call for entries, I realized that, or maybe not even right then, maybe later, I realized that I'm not the kind of person to go to meetings about coppers, and I'm not going to go pound my fists on tables, and I'm not going to organize, but I can make a painting. And it was nice to realize that. So that's what got me interested in it.
So Murphy's Wellbeing is an installation that functions as a consultancy. The Florida Research Ensemble, composed of myself and Greg Ulmer and Barbara Jo Ravel, Lou Kao and Sam Lopez, have constructed this piece with the intent of doing just exactly that, literally. We are an art consultancy. We are trying to propose that a way to deal with this issue, with these kinds of disasters, is to reconstruct our priorities culturally, and that we have to prioritize well-being, individual and collective well-being. And so the goal is that we'll illuminate the sets of conditions that caused the Copper Superfund site to exist. So we draw a parallel between the threat to our well field and the threat to our well-being, that those things are not separated, that they are very much one and the same. And that once we become aware of that, hopefully we'll change directions in the way that we act and behave.
Probably by the late 70s, the University of Florida, at least the academic side, knew there was a problem. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or the agency that they were at that time, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency formally recognized this site as a Superfund site. And I think it was 1983 when they listed it formally as a site, and they put it on what's called the National Priority List. Basically, that's a list of the most toxic waste sites in the United States.
It really pissed me off that I was working at the University of Florida a mile away from one of the Superfund sites, and that it was less than 2 miles away from the Murphy well fields where Gainesville gets all of its water. I mean, literally, I was shocked that this was an issue that was, it was there, and it was part of the community's literal lifeblood, and then I found out almost no one in Gainesville knew anything about it. That perplexed me. So I was initially pissed off, and then I was perplexed that nobody seemed to be aware of this.
I had a teacher, Joanna Macy, who 20 years ago, she called herself an ecofeminist. She was addressing toxic waste sites with radioactive waste. And she said, this stuff's not going anywhere. What are we going to do about it? She introduced to me the concept that when we, as humans, create such a gigantic mess of toxicity, we have to step up and be responsible. We can't just slip anything under the rug. In fact, she talked about making it a sacred site. That not only do we remember what's going on, but we bring reverence to that. That we teach our children, wow, we made a mistake. We're going to talk about it. We're going to teach you the big mistake we made so you don't have to make that anymore. And that to me struck such a bell that the toxic sites on this planet now become temples and they become altars, that we don't have to continue damaging our planet, that we use the mistakes to teach the children, inspire the children, and be accountable. There's power in being accountable.
The Superfund site affects everyone. It's a very dangerous issue to me. The aquifer is being affected.
The concern we have with the Floridan aquifer is that is our area's primary source of drinking water, really the sole source of drinking water. We don't have surface waters in our area that would be sufficient to supply the community's drinking water. So we are dependent on the Florida aquifer.
I think that, you know, we're going to have to be patient, and they're going to continue to try to remediate the actual site. And I think in a way it could be sort of a wake-up call.
I think the project might help other communities and this community because everyone's affected differently. As an educator, I understand that everyone learns in a different way, and we have visual learners. So it's going to take seeing things to affect some people. It'll help them understand, the visual thinkers. The process is, I've always come from a psychological place when I make images. And this was an image, the title is Aquaphobia, Masking the Issue. And it's a drawing that came from a photograph of a friend, a good friend of mine who was a mime at the time, washing off her white face, in this case in very questionable water. And I feel like people are going to have to really look for what's going on in the picture. They'll find clues and find another clue and another clue. They're very tiny and they're ambiguous, kind of like the issue.
I spent a lot of my life as a psychologist trying to create wholeness out of situations that are very fracturing. This whole coppers thing is part of life that's very fracturing. It's very traumatic. It can, in effect, crush people. What I'm interested in doing is creating an experience where at very least that struggle gets voice. Out of that struggle, hopefully dialogue will happen about the struggle on both sides, on all sides of all this, and a wholeness can get created.
The concern is that a couple of miles north of the Coppers Cabot site is the Murphy well field. And what that is, that's the City of Gainesville Regional Utilities water supply well field. And that's an area where they've got a number of wells that are installed all the way down to the Florida aquifer. And they're pumping the Florida aquifer, and that is our drinking water source.
We have to get past this kind of us and them mentality where people look at one set of people and say, okay, they're in this situation and that's really, you know, too bad for them, but it doesn't affect me. We have to realize that these problems affect all of us, especially when it comes to the well field and our water in north central Florida, that the situation isn't isolated to just the neighborhood where that structure exists, that eventually it will contaminate everyone's water, and that's something that the cost is much greater than the local cleanup entails at this point.
If this contamination got into the wells, the cost of water in Gainesville would it could just totally damage the economy, because all of a sudden water that's relatively cheap now and people have a pretty high confidence level in it, all of a sudden it would be really expensive to treat that water.
I spent a lot of my time attending meetings and just talking to people on the street to get the material for the piece, and been fascinated by the difference of experience between these two groups and the fact that you get this range of emotion. All good art is about touching on someone's emotion, and it's about expressing an emotion, and there's been a lot of it on both sides. The range of emotions goes from anger to denial in terms of the residents. The experience of the people who are treating this situation or responsible for cleaning it up, there's an optimism that's being expressed. There's a feeling that they want to instill confidence. They're in effect marketing and selling their help to the community, so that they're very positive and very upbeat in a very tragic situation.
You know, back in 1800s and early 1900s, artists did all these beautiful, pretty pictures of the wild landscapes, Herzog and the Luminists, and people did these sort of like travelogue paintings showing what wonders of nature there were, and this is not that. And the reason it's not is that that's gone. There's no more wilderness. I mean, maybe some national parks, but certainly not around here. And so this is not like one of those pretty pictures of the, of the natural world. I think that if I taped crime scene tape across here, that the idea would come across better.
The companies responsible for this contamination, we don't know where they are going to be in 20 or 30 years. I mean, are they going to declare bankruptcy? Are they going to somehow do some kind of a takeover and a subsidiary thing where all of a sudden the assets are moved around? And so we don't want the community to be stuck with a $100 million cleanup, or that's just something that we don't want to have to deal with. So that's why it's so important to move forward now. I mean, not only to really figure out how far the contamination is spread, but also to deal with it, because we really do want to hold the responsible parties accountable now. We don't want this coming back to bite us 20 or 30 years from now.
The materials that I've used in my piece are all materials from the creek bed. They're thousands of years old, and they are fossilized bones, flint, glass, wood, vertebrae. All of these things have been in the creek for thousands of years, or much before the Cabot Copper site was even here. It's my hope that these pieces would represent all of the people and energy that can be put forth to reclaim this area. The creek has a spirit, and I'm trying to represent that spirit in the work that I have done. And the small pieces of the mosaic represent all of the people coming together to help clean, clear, and make this site, this watershed, as well as the aquifer, clean and viable again.
I decided I had to make a kind of a big change from moving from the landscapes, which were kind of neutral politically, and kind of deal with these in a way that I suppose would be kind of aligned with the notion of editorial cartoons that you might see in the paper. The EPA, gallops to the rescue. That's kind of a tongue-in-cheek title. And so I allowed myself to deal with sarcasm and in drawing, it is, and other kinds of fairly pointed states of mind in order to deal with this.
Another component of this is that following the exhibition at the Thomas Center, we want to put this exhibit on tour, because there are 43 sites in Florida, a number of Superfund sites, and there are places in the areas that are impacted by Superfund sites where this exhibition might mean a great deal to the citizens in that area. They might be able to see an exhibit like this, to be inspired to do something similar in their community, to try to bring artists and scientists together, and corporate entities as well, and government agencies, to face these problems together and work on them and find some kind of common solution.
My painting is basically a map, a child's map of the creek and the surrounding area from the copper site. And it includes all the trees that we climbed that we had named. It includes tree forts and springs where we would catch fish, and the banks where we would get clay to make pots, and the special places that we went, including neighbors' houses and my aunt's house that was just down the creek from me. And it includes the site itself, which we just called the pole yard. and it includes the Big Black Pond, which was actually the big ponds of creosote where they dipped the telephone poles, and it includes the big hill where we always rode our bikes. We would sneak under the fence and go in and ride our bikes on a large dirt hill, which was actually where they dug out to make the Big Black Pond. And it includes the tunnel under 6th Street where we would get in the creek in our John boats, and especially after rain, go down the creek. And it's basically just a map in oil of the neighborhood.
You know, I think a nice ultimate goal for Gainesville in relation to the copper site is to get that thing cleaned up and to maybe make a park out of it.
With the Superfund site, I think the Superfund Art Project raises the awareness of people in the area by publishing information essentially on the history, the proposed remediation, and the future use and reclamation of the site. Now, I think that's really what the most important part of this is. There are other kind of aside aspects to this where it's a really interesting idea for the Superfund Art Project to be a situation involving artists and scientists and other people in the community coming together and looking at this whole thing from a faceted perspective, which I don't think has probably ever been done before. I certainly don't think it's been done in Gainesville. In fact, I was telling Rebecca Nagy, who's director of the Harn Museum of Art, that this may be one of the most cutting-edge and exciting art projects that's ever been shown in Gainesville because of the fact that the artists and the scientists and other interested people collaborated on such a complex project.
My work that I have in this show is called the Citizen Biodetector, and it's a wearable sensor device that basically allows the user to walk around and sample water quality while storing the data to a flashcard and mapping it with GPS information. So you can sort of walk an area and build up this collection of data that can then be mapped on Google Maps or other visualization software. The exhibit here tonight, Region 4 Transformation Through Imagination, is sort of the product of 2 years of work that we've been working at this, over that amount of time. And so it's really great to see the show, see all the pieces in the show here. I think it's a wild success, and I just can't believe that I got to be part of this.
Beginning with our ignorance of the consequence of our actions and continuing through our poorly coordinated efforts at remedy, human error must be overcome by concentrated human caring. That's the message we want to get out.
Thank you.